Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 77. The topic is How Cedar Simplifies Authorization for Developers. And our guest today is Dinesh Rajasekaharan, Director and Product Manager of Platform for Amazon, and he specializes in the area of data security and developer experience. Welcome, Dinesh.
Hey Mike, hello everyone.
So, Dinesh, before we dive into the topic at hand, it would be great if you could just give people a quick overview of how you got here and your background.
Yes, for sure, Mike. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm super excited to speak on this topic. This is something very near and dear to my heart, the entire authorization ecosystem. Um, I have been wearing different hats across my career. I've been an engineer, engineering manager, product manager. I worked across databases, a lot of security, identity and access management, a lot, anonymizations, encryptions, key management. I happen to work a lot on CRMs also. This is customer relationship management. I was part of Salesforce. I was director of their platform. A lot of developer experience that landed me where I am here at Amazon. At Amazon, I am part of the internal Amazon security. This is where a lot of innovation also happens across Amazon businesses. So I handle the authentication stack, authorization stack. I also own the account management set of services at Amazon.
So, we also have the pleasure of collaborating at the OpenID Authz working group, where you're one of the contributors. And actually, so I want to start the podcast by sort of following up on a quick conversation we had before this about the difference between OPA and Cedar,
Yep.
because OPA is a great product, and we love, Rego. It's very powerful and expressive. Um, but I think that, and then maybe they're even the incumbent today, because I think enterprises have noticed how good OPA is for Kubernetes access control and are wondering if they can extend it further in their enterprise. So OPA as sort of a starting point, just to level set us, what do you have any quick thoughts on a comparison between OPA and Cedar strengths and weaknesses?
Yep. Great topic. Um, One of the stories is even before Cedar and AVP existed as it stands today, we took OPA, Open Policy Engine.
Amazon verified permissions for the
Yes,
um, super familiar, yeah, which is a hosted service that offers sort of Cedar as a service, right?
yes, correct. Even before Amazon verified permissions, hosted services of Cedar existed today. In Amazon internally, we took OPA and then we augmented it to a lot of Amazon's business use cases internally. This is across retail, digital, Prime Video, healthcare services, and then devices. So we had an internal implementation of OPA, out of which there is a lot of research, user research that happened, contemplation that happened that led to kind of a cedar also. um, for example, OPA uses regular rego, right? So which means that as a average developer, I need to deeply understand how to write an access policy in regular expression. Now, for simpler use cases, I can easily do it. Now, as the regulatory landscape across the globe has been changing, sometimes the access policy itself uh, is will get really sophisticated. And then, in course of this talk, also I will show you how it is. So we were contemplating on how can we further simplify expressing an access policy. Even a business user can define it declaratively. So that kickstarted the whole Cedar thought process. For example, at Amazon internally, we do have, for example, users at Amazon warehouses who are not very technical, and then they have to define their authorization through the interfaces we provide to them. Same with global real estate and facility user personas who are not deeply technical. So we want them to spend minimal time on IAM in general, identity and access management in general. So that led to the whole Cedar. So regular expression, OPA. Um, then we want, our intent is to make it really simple, make it very declarative for our users. That led to Cedar. Um, if you're okay, I want to actually share a few examples here. Like, what
Yeah,
does the
yeah,
conversation look like?
great. And so please share your slides, and I'll do my best to get it on. It's always a bit of a crapshoot with Restream. Um, But the name of the OPA language is Rego, and Rego is a full programming language that allows you to express policies. And it sounds like from what you're saying that there's also, so you had to understand, developers had to understand how to write Rego, and that was sort of a challenge. Is that what you were saying?
Oh, yes, yes, that is a challenge. Now, that will also lead to a ecosystem of chain of events. For example, I'm an application developer. I am authoring a policy. Now I need to learn a language. It may take X amount of time for me to understand it. And then I have to define a policy in that language. Now I need to keep this thing updated as my application landscape changes. Sometimes it itself could be a very challenging task for me, right? For example, if GDPR hits me or a EU Digital Markets Act hits me, so now I need to comprehend what does it mean in terms of my access policy, and then I have to take this and programmatically I have to refine this, test it, make sure I'm not breaking my application, my users and all, and then I have to deploy it in production. So there is like whole SDLC that gets affected uh,
Hmm.
at the heart of this whole problem statement. Versus if the policy definition, analysis, testing, ongoing evolution itself is very declarative, easily I can write it in terms of a business terminology language declaratively. It simplifies a lot as a developer for me.
Interesting distinction. I like how you're using declarative policies there. Did you want to share your screen? I can. And for those who are just listening, I'll give a quick overview of what Dinesh is showing. At some point, we're going to publish this as a podcast too when we get our act together. Um,
Are you able to see my screen?
I am, although I'm seeing it half black and half white this time. Um,
All right. Let
I
me
guess
let me reshare it again.
it was okay in the non-view. In the non, let's see. Okay, that's good. I see it. And for some reason, this time it's showing. It was better just in the document view. Actually, if you can just show that one,
Okay.
it's a little. Yeah, that view is better. Sorry, we see your notes.
Yeah.
If you want to maximize it, I think people could find it. But yeah.
Let me.
So you're showing basically a policy. This is a read access policy, and on one side you say traditional, and I guess traditional means ABAC, or what does traditional mean exactly?
Yeah, traditional
Yeah,
as like a non-Cedar language. So it could be a JSON. For example, here it's a JSON, right? Um, so here it's a simple read access policy. The way I write it in JSON.
yeah,
Versus if I want to represent that in Cedar on the right hand side, this is how it will look like. Almost very intuitive, right? So almost intuitive as in, hey, I want to allow this user with the role with the following resource type, kind of a thing. And then I want it's also like simple for me to keep on updating this. So this is one of the core tenets of Cedar.
right.
Um,
Ergonomic syntax, and
economics
this
in
is really important because the auditors who are reading these policies aren't necessarily programmers, and they need to be able to read them and understand them. And I think they can do that with RBAC today. Like auditors can understand RBAC. Like if a person has this role, But some of these newer systems that are based on triples, there's no way to actually read the policies and convert them into human understandable unless you have some type of interpretation engine that generates a visual view or something. But yeah, we're excited about the ergonomic syntax of Cedar. Um, and um, Let me actually try and unshare this now. Um,
I want to actually,
and
okay, Mike, I want to show you a few more examples here. What I
Oh,
want to
okay.
show you is the spectrum of representation. So what we have seen here is just a simple read access policy. Uh, let's add a one more layer of complexity to that whole read access policy, where I want to say that, hey, if somebody is part of a team A or B or C, then I want to allow an access, right? So if I have to write it in JSON on my left hand side, I would generally, traditionally, this is how I will write it. um,
Yeah.
but Cedar ergonomically will further simplify this on the right hand side. um, and then let's keep on building this just as a use case. Right now I want to add one more layer to it, like a resource attribute. Now, we if we slightly are transitioning from a traditional role-based access control model to a fine-grained authorization model, which is where Cedar also excels. Where now I want to bring, if the resource visibility is public here on my left-hand side again, JSON, and then I want to create like a kind of a very simple allow and deny policy. This in JSON, this
Hmm.
is how I look like, versus on the right hand side I can make a action based and declaratively ergonomically I can write a syntax in Cedar like, hey, this is how it's like. So if somebody as a role admin, then they have a access to this specific resource with the following attribute. um, now
Yeah, it's very good at
yeah.
doing. I like the way Amina Torlak in her talk at reInvent, which I reference in our docs a lot, talks about how Cedar combines RBAC and ABAC, where RBAC is more permissive and ABAC is gives you that extra granularity when you need it, although there's a performance hit. Um, so yeah, the properties of Cedar are very interesting. I have a back channel conversation with Jeff Lombardo about whether Cedar should be, is it ABAC or is it CBAC? Does it introduce some properties that the Cedar engine that somehow differentiated from traditional ABAC? And I think you're showing some of these features that make Cedar kind of interesting.
Yeah, yeah, this is another example what I'm showing here. Like, it's a combination of roles and resource attributes, how I can stitch them together. On the right hand side where I'm representing this in Cedar, this is not exactly the Cedar syntax, but I'm trying
Yeah,
to represent the intent of it in Cedar. Almost like it will become as simple as how I'm writing it here. Then if the user has this role, then if the attribute is a resource, and then you give an access to this resource, kind of a simplistic
yeah.
style. This can
And
even go.
so
Yeah.
just to point out a possible optimization here, and I find on the Cedar Slack, whenever I post a policy, I get 10 responses for better ways I could write the policy. In
Mhm.
this case, you could actually just make, you, for example, you could do a mapping between a role, you could create a role entity. So you could literally just say admin um, there. You don't even need to say allow user.role admin. We could do a mapping of that role to the admin role, and then we can just say admin has access to. So Cedar has some very elegant ways that you can use groups in order to, instead of actually writing principles about users themselves, you could just make the RBAC very naturally. So yeah, this is a real art form that I think is you can you can sort of just write it off the cuff like this, but also it gets even smaller. I think sometimes it's like, yeah, when you write something long, it's harder to make it shorter. And I
Mhm.
think Cedar, like as you get to know it deeper, there are some opportunities to even make it more condensed, more concise than you first think.
Yep, yep. um, I briefly mentioned about the regulatory landscape, how it is
Hmm.
changing right now. which is what I want to show you as another example. I briefly mentioned
Sure.
about Digital Markets Act, right? So where now in EU, Europe,
Yeah.
there's a regulation like if I consent, I should be able to share my shopping cart. Amazon is obligated to share the shopping cart information, order information with a competitor. Same goes with Apple versus Spotify. So I have my playlist in Apple based on my consent. Now Apple is obligated to share it with Spotify. So in which case the access policy, what, like, imagine what does it mean for an access policy? It is going all the way down to the data source of it, like the row and column level. For Dinesh's playlist somewhere stored in the database, I have to create like a policy that says this row, this column is allowed to share with this entity. At the same time, I want to make sure that is not broadly shareable, in which case it will become a different security nightmare. Now,
Yeah.
that's a pretty sophisticated scenario for an average developer to comprehend that kind of an access policy and write it. Which is what I want to show you here, which is kind of a whole towards an attribute based access control realm. Now I need to figure out who is my identity attribute, what is an action being performed on what kind of a resource being performed, and then
Right.
this resource could be a tuple in a database, and then what is a environment, the context in which the action is being performed, is in a Europe versus in North America versus an APAC. And then if I have to take this and write it in a regular expression or a JSON or a Python, it gets pretty like programmatic for a developer, and then keep on updating it. Versus Cedar being having a very ergonomic syntax, the evolution of this policy as a new regulation gets added, it becomes almost like intuitively incremental. I'm doing a small additions versus I'm learning this totally new programming thing.
Yeah. At Glue, we're building a sort of developer tooling level to allow more drag and drop graphical ways to build the policies. Because although you mentioned they are pretty easy to write, we still think that there's a level of developer tooling above the syntax itself. My feeling about the syntax is that it should be readable. Like
Mhm.
what, whether, however the developers write it, whether some developers love, like, Visual Studio, and they'll write it in Visual Studio, and other developers might use our more fancy developer graphical tools. Um, but however the policies get written, I think it's really important that the auditors can read it um, and review it. And I love your example. I love one thing I love about your example about the data laws in Europe is, one, try expressing that in RBAC, like,
Yes.
not happening. Um, and then two, it gets at the why. The policy is, this data should be shareable. And the why is because there's new regulations that require it. And I think one of the challenges, and Andre Koot from the last live stream made a great point of this, is that, and I tend to be very focused on the policy expression, development, and enforcement part of it, but on the governance part of it, it also has to map back to what, this person is able to do this, but why is he able to do that, or she able to do that? And making that is going to require some new business processes, probably, to capture. As we move to fancier types of policy expressions, I think we're going to see more need to map this back to the original reasons, so we understand where these policies are coming from. Um,
Yep, that is
let
correct.
me,
In a nutshell, what I wanted to share in those 4 or 5 examples is it is not just the ergonomic syntax that is anyways there, but the range, the spectrum of use cases that will Cedar will help cover, all the way from role-based access control examples like a simple read policy, to the right
true.
end of the spectrum to an attribute-based access control, very complex, sophisticated Digital Markets Act policy, and anywhere in between. So as a developer now, my I have to do this once. At least I have to know this syntax, which is anyways easy for me to learn it once, and then as the evolution of regulatory landscapes happen, to me, I don't need to do a massive open heart surgery for my application to rip something apart and then put something else.
Right. In my view of the world, which I don't know if it aligns with everyone else's, each application has its own policy store. So my feeling is that if you're the CRM application, you don't need the policies for the ERP. You only need your policies. So that the policies are developed alongside of the application, um, and have their own code review process. Maybe there's an extra or different code review process for policies versus, the UI code, for example. Um, but my basic idea is that each application has its own policies. Whereas I think some people, in their frame of mind from the old days, they think of the policy store having all the policies for all the applications. I think one of the trends we're seeing is that the developers, the policies are more application sort of specific and scoped. Um, do you agree with that? Do you see that the development of the policies is sort of like should be a new task for the development team, and that they really need to think about sort of as they're writing the applications, how they're writing the policies?
Oh, yes, yes. Great point. I would actually break it down into two parts. First is, as a developer, I am writing a net new application. The second scenario is, as a developer, I have an application that has been running for a decade very successfully. Now I need to do some authorization changes. I need to make a policy changes to this. Now, for the first scenario, where as a developer I'm writing a net new application, um, mostly I can make an effort to learn whether it is a Rego in OPA or versus a Cedar. Of course, Cedar is going to make it simple, and then I have to do this. Um, Versus if it is an existing application, then it's much more painful for me to do this. In which scenario, what you're trying to say is absolutely right, right? So I don't want to go an application by application. Let's say it's a large enterprise and then they have tens of thousands of application. Getting into an application code, identifying where the authorization is hard coded, try to change that and map it back to a common policy, versus to your point where I can channelize the access entry points or the evaluation points to a common place, such as an API gateway, for example. So that becomes, this is where I have a singular place where I will go define the policy, and then the evolution point of such as an API gateway that talks to my policy decision point PDP, makes easier so that I don't need to go modify tens and thousands of applications.
Right. I'm actually glad you went to API Gateway because that was on my list. On the Authz call, we had a quick conversation about API Gateway as sort of a natural place. And my take on zero trust is that we want the policy decision point in the browser, because these days modern applications, a lot of the should I display this button or not, that gets decided in the app. So I
Yep.
believe we need the PDP in the browser. We need it in the API gateway. We need it in the backend applications,
Yep.
and potentially we also need the PDP when we are issuing tokens. Should I issue a token with this scope? That might be based on policy. So I see the PDP distributed, and potentially, by the way, on the data side, should I give access to this column or this set of data, or give access to the data in this region? So in my view of zero trust, the PDP is distributed across um, the whole network. But let's just talk about the API gateway because that's a natural choke point that we've seen, like as products as old as Novell from the 90s were using the API gateway as a natural choke point for authorization. Um, and what do you think is the opportunity for Cedar there? Like, what's the case that you're going to make about Cedar or authorization in general, maybe Authz in general, around API gateways? Um, and what did you think about some of the proposed solutions on the Authz call this week?
Oh yeah. I'm going to speak less on what's going to happen on AWS side versus, but in general, the intent of what we were trying to do as part of the Authz is define the standard ABAC API, take it, embed it to the known API gateways across the industry. For example, MuleSoft Salesforce, or
Kong.
yeah, or AWS API gateway, and then the moment it happens, what almost the authorization problem will uh, dial down to something like an OpenID Connect kind of a scenario. I'm just using it as an example, like connect with log in with Google, log in with Apple, log in with an Amazon, right? For a developer, for me, the evaluation is already there. The gateway, which is a choking point, like right, you rightly said, um, understands the scope of what is allowed, what is denied. The syntax is universal, like everything out there now understands commonly. Mike is what does identity mean, resource mean, action mean, Mike can access, cannot access. So for a developer, they can move on, focus more on their business logic, make money for their company, versus trying to bog down in the whole identity and access management ecosystem. uh,
The mistake, uh, I was going to say, just drilling down on the API gateway vendors a little bit. The mistake I see API gateway vendors make is that become the issuer of tokens and not the consumer of tokens.
yeah.
Um, And I also see them implementing a lot of their own like authorization. So for example, KrakenD, which is a Linux Foundation API gateway, uses CEL, CEL. This is
Mhm.
a common expression language. Um, and then I see things like Kong saying that they'll do a one-off integration with OPA, or
Mhm.
Tyke might do a one-off integration with OPA.
Mhm.
I see API gateways as particularly ripe for using Authz because if the API gateway vendors have to do a one-off integration with each of the different PDP vendors, then we're gonna get a not very good list of like how to express our policies, and I just think that the API gateway vendors themselves don't want to have to do a one-off integration with every PDP.
Yep.
Um, However, where it breaks down, so great, all the API vendors decide authzen is it. We're going to use that, and we're just going to write one authzen connector. But then where it starts to break down a little bit is what are we sending as the principal? What are
Yep.
we sending as the resource? What are we sending as the action? For
Yep.
example, on the call, my contention is that post, put, delete, get is the action, but one of the other, but maybe somebody would like to see that as part of the resource. Maybe the get is just part of the resource description. And then, for example, how do we describe the action? Cedar has its own schema syntax for how you describe actions, but Axiomatics has a different probably way that you describe actions. So the level of even though we might say that all these gateways support, authzen, they might still get bogged down in implementation points of the PDP. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? Yeah.
um, um, you kind of an answered what you're when you're trying to ask that. It is still better than a company X interpreting a resource, and then a company Y interpreting principle instead of a resource. This is why the whole work of Authzen is to standardize the API for authorization. So at least to your point, when you say action of get, put, read, write, if we standardize that, just like a OAuth to RFC, right? Every company will take that, interpret it in the same way. There will still be a confusion, but at least the interpretation will be in the same way. And then there is like an incremental progress, like in OpenID Connect, where we have an ID token. What contains in the ID token? Whether this token should be stateful, stateless, revocation, those are the extensions that will come later on. But the fundamental confusion of whether A versus Y, principal versus resource, the big topics, at least we are hopeful it will be resolved. The adoption of attribute-based access control will be simpler. You also made an interesting point a few minutes ago about embedding within the browser. I'm super curious about that approach. The reason I'm super curious is, um, we all think this is a defense in depth. It is not a binary whether I want to do this in the browser versus an API gateway versus the resource. The defense in depth where I want to go all the way in, right? So it is an at the client level, the IDP level evaluation, uh, and then that will complement the API level policy evaluation that can complement with the resource level, the policy evaluation. Now, at the resource level, it can get even much more nuanced. For example, if I have a three-tier traditional application architecture, I'm going all the way to the database. So I'm an admin, I'm writing the query directly bypassing all these layers to the database. How are we going to enforce an access policy there? In which case the policy needs to be sitting closer and embedded evaluation to the database itself. So this is how I think, like, it is not like either or.
Right.
Each of these layers in the stack can complement each other. Now there is also the flip side, the other side of this story, which is a data centric approach for access management itself. uh, there was a time, this is almost like a decade back, industry was almost split it into two parts, where an identity centric access and a data centric access. Now I do have all these identities and principles trying to access something. That something could be an API or a data or something like that. And then through what means? Through a browser, through a client, through a RPC call, through an SSH command, through a SQL query or something like that. And then there was a lot of focus on who is accessing, by what means they are accessing,
Mhm.
less on what is being accessed. But then there is an other side. Almost decade back, the conversation came around like, what, let's actually pivot towards what is being accessed, and then make that before the cart, put that before the cart, which is the data, and then try to make an access decisions based on the data being accessed and how data is being flowed. So this is where the whole data access management becomes much more relevant to the access policy. So data discovery and classification sits right up front there, where discovering what kind of data being accessed, customer data, HIPAA compliant data, PCI data, uh, and then how the data is flowing through my very complicated call chain, user calling an application, calling a service B, all the way up to the source of the database.
Right.
And then the access policy percolating across this whole call chain, focused on the data.
Right. I
So
call that the cryptographic chain of custody,
there,
actually. You start in the browser, you start with clients getting tokens, presenting them to the application, presenting them to APIs, and you want to be able to prove across the whole chain, that basically to cryptographically prove that it has to be this person using this browser on this device. Um, but one other thing I wanted to point out was the logs. I think people forget about the logs. If
Mhm.
you're only doing enforcement on the API gateway and beyond, you're only seeing the calls that made it up to the API gateway. So an attacker could try and do 500 different things on the app that get denied, and then one thing gets allowed, and that gets sent up to the API gateway where a decision is. But the decision log about what the person tried to do at the edge is critical for intrusion detection and anomaly detection. And what I see is that a lot of companies today are just saying, well, I can't trust the front end, but that doesn't mean you don't want the logs from the front end about what's happening. And it's not just the standardization of the policies, but the standardization of the decision log
Yeah.
that becomes important.
Yeah, true. This is very true. So going back to where I started this conversation about, it's not about API gateway or the browser or the mobile client. It is actually all across. So one of the Authz OpenID Foundation working group agenda, as you know, is we are starting with API gateway because that seems to be much more relevant now. But we also want to go and layer in with the IDPs, no industry known IDPs partner with IDPs, we also want to go on the resources also, the known middleware providers across the industry, and then make sure like Authz and PDP is embedded with the
Yeah.
middleware.
I see Authz stops at the client because, like, for a sidecar, for example, when we built the Cedarling sidecar, Authz was the natural interface because that's a container running in the cloud where we need a REST API. Authz was perfect for that. But when we actually embed in the browser, we have a JavaScript application that's just importing and it's just calling directly from JavaScript. Um, so we don't actually need the REST API. It would be superfluous in the application to make a REST API and get a response when we can just use a JavaScript library directly. Um, so I kind of feel like Auth starts at the cloud. When you need a cloud, like something like a container, at that point, anything that exists in the cloud, Auth makes good sense as the interface. I wanted to ask to pivot a little bit towards tokens because I think I've had some interesting breakthroughs mentally about tokens, even after looking at tokens for years and years. But my mental breakthrough is that the token really is the principal. So if I have an access token, that I basically can create a workload principal because I have a client ID that's been signed and I have other claims in the access token, and that was obtained at the token endpoint where client authentication is required. If I have an ID token and a user info token, I have a user entity. If a company has a different type of token, maybe they have a widget JWT, they
Mhm.
can map that to a widget principal and make. But my one sort of contention here is that when we send, think about Park, principal, action, resource, context, I really think the principle is what tokens are you sending me? Um, do you agree with me, or do you think the Authz and sort of the industry is aligned with me, or am I sort of out on a limb here?
um, um, yes, and then something even beyond yes, I would say. First is yes, at bare minimal, the token considered as a principal makes sense. Why? Because OAuth 2 kind of standardize this whole thing, right? So your average jot JSON web token that has user information into it, at least know that who is accessing what. Now the reason I want to say beyond that is, um, the token itself can become stateless. Let's hypothetically assume that the whole complex call chain I mentioned in my previous example, where you have n minus one number of services in between serving the user and the resource, the data being accessed in a web application, uh, where the microservices architecture, the token is being passed from the client to a service A, to service B, to service C, and so on, all the way to the resource being accessed. Now, if hypothetically assume the token itself contains the resource, the action being performed, and then almost like the chain identities of service A, service B, and service C, so that nobody is tampering with the token, and the resource being accessed, and for which it is accessed, almost that will become much more efficient and performant for each time a service sitting in this call chain making a call back to the resource, to the provider, to the IDP, versus they trust the token itself being a stateless. And then as they do, they keep adding their portion of the information to the token and then passing it to the next service, passing to the next service itself. So coming back to your point, I do agree. Yes, principle makes sense. I think kind of an OAuth to standardize that. But what it will even more help for everybody is if this token could be transitive in nature, with the action resource being accessed, then the context also being almost as a chain as it passes through.
Yeah. Well, so the token's signed, so you can't add any new information to it. But what we see a lot of is enrichment of the token or token exchange. So I am a service. I was presented a token by a downstream service, um, and I want to maybe present this token for token exchange. So there's a new OAuth standard called transaction tokens, which is actually defined as a token exchange, where because the audience of the original token might be one service, and another service might want to enrich that token. So a token exchange might be required in order to enrich that token and get a new association to present downstream. So I think that I 100% agree with the performance side that you want sort of pop autonomy. So the data should all be present, no external calls are required, and this is how we're going to be able to get hundreds of decisions per millisecond because all the data is right there. But in terms of enrichment, I think at that point you're talking about federation and trust because either you trust the parameters because of MTLS, or you're going to have to get some type of new assertion where the entire payload is signed, so you have integrity over the whole payload, the whole new enriched token. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think. What's interesting to me is that there is a lot of the challenge of security comes into how do we enrich that token? How do we call the fraud detection service and pass that along downstream? And so the IDP is in a position to integrate with some of the enhanced security services and enrich the token. And as it flows along this trajectory of doing different transactions on behalf of different workloads, there's a person who got authenticated, but as we traverse this sort of back-end API landscape, it's really one piece of software talking to another piece of software. And this area, I think, is growing quite a bit itself, the non-human identity part or workload identity.
Yeah,
Um,
I kind of got super excited. This is almost like a decade ago when blockchains got into existence, right? So this is a kind of problem where every node in the sequence doing a token exchange, coming back, passing it on, the node 2 making a token exchange, coming back. The amount of
yeah,
latency it adds to the application is a humongous. And then I thought like probably blockchain is a decent shot. I don't know, like it didn't take off at that point. But then cryptographically making sure like it's a tamper proof and then it's peer to peer kind of a communication versus saving an additional exchange call every time the request passes through the call chain.
yeah.
It was an
I
interesting.
would say if you're not enhancing the token, you can just pass it to the next service. I think that's fine. But if you want to enrich the token with additional claims, I think then potentially you might need to reissue the token. If that's your trust model, that you're going to validate the signatures of the tokens. Token, this is one thing that we're working on at Glue in the Cedarling, which is that the Cedarling performs token signature validation and checks to make sure that the token's not revoked.
Hmm.
Because another issue is that if you're not introspecting or reissuing the token, exchanging the token, possibly that token is no longer valid. And if you want to do immediate revocation, there's a new OAuth standard around status lists and revocation, where just like a certificate, you want to check the signature and you want to check the certificate revocation list to make sure it's not revoked from the CA.
Hmm.
OAuth now has a similar thing. So I think that OAuth has a lot of features, and I feel like people are so excited about moving to the next level. Half of us haven't figured out to use what we already have, and there's already like a lot there in OAuth around how do we mint tokens for workloads and how do we use those in sort of a microservices environment. Um,
Yeah,
we're right at time. I want to give you last thoughts. Any, we could probably go on for hours, but any last thoughts for the audience?
no,
Cedar
I
authorization.
just want to, first of all, I want to say thank you. This is a super exciting topic, and thank you for the opportunity, Mike. I really appreciate it. Cedar, the key takeaways are access policies, because of the regulatory landscape out there, they're drastically evolving. They're going all the way from RBAC to ABAC and somewhere in between. And then the policy declaration itself should be less painful for the developers as simple as a business user can come and declare it, as we are speaking right now in a plain English. So that is where we want to take Cedar towards. And then Cedar, I feel like it provides that kind of a simplicity, as well as the flexibility to express a wide spectrum of scenarios from our back to a back. Um, and then we will keep enhancing that. My only request to the community is, the more you all embrace Cedar, the more you use Cedar. As you know, Cedar is open source, so you community driven program, so you all use it, it will just get better.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dinesh, for sharing your perspective today from inside of Amazon and contributing on Authz. And we'll keep this conversation going because, yeah, I think this is definitely one of the key innovations, in the identity space. So thank you for pushing the ball forward a little.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, audience. By the way, if you could go to LinkedIn and just hit follow on the LinkedIn Identity Office live stream page, that would be great. You'll hear about more great events. Next episode, I mentioned non-human identities. Well, next episode, we're going to talk about nothing but non-human identities. So please join us on Tuesday. So thank you, Dinesh. Thank you, audience.